I was 14 when I first tasted freedom, bitter and cold, like the winter air that seeped through the cracks of my resolve. My parents, if you could call them that, were more like ghosts haunting the shattered remnants of my childhood. The bottle was their god, and the bruises their offerings. I had become nothing more than a punching bag for my father's drunken fists and a scapegoat for my mother's misery. Running away seemed like the only option. I remember that night vividly, the smell of cheap whiskey lingering in the air, the dull thud of my father's snores vibrating through the thin walls, and my mother's vacant eyes staring at nothing. I packed a small bag, taking only the essentials, a few clothes, a worn-out book that had once been my escape, and a picture of the family we used to be before the darkness consumed us. The streets were unforgiving, but they were a relief compared to the hell I had left behind. I found shelter in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a crumbling structure forgotten by time, much like me. It wasn't much, but it was better than the suffocating grip of my old life. 2 years passed, and I had survived, barely. My health had deteriorated from the cold nights and the grueling work I managed to find as a loader. But the streets were merciless, and survival often meant pushing your body past its limits. When I was fired for being too weak to carry the heavy loads, I found myself homeless once again, with nowhere to turn. I thought about returning to my parents, but I knew they wouldn't care. They hadn't even bothered to look for me when I left. One day, out of desperation, I went back to my old neighborhood. The place had changed, but the emptiness in my heart remained the same. A neighbor told me my parents had lost the apartment to debts and had moved to some distant village. No forwarding address, no trace. Just gone, like they had never existed. I found solace in an abandoned house, where I spent my days scavenging for food and money. Life had become a monotonous cycle of survival until one night, I woke up to the smell of smoke. It took me a moment to register what was happening. The crackling of wood, the distant shouts, there was a fire nearby. I cautiously approached the window and saw flames consuming a house a few streets over. People had gathered around, their faces illuminated by the glow of the fire, but none of them moved to help. They just stood there, watching as if they were spectators at a show. And then I saw her, a young girl, trapped inside the burning house, banging on the window, her face streaked with tears. The crowd murmured, wondering if the firefighters would arrive in time, but no one stepped forward. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that every second counted. Without thinking, I grabbed a ladder lying on the ground and propped it against the side of the house. The flames were growing stronger, and thick smoke filled the room where the girl was trapped. I climbed up, shattered the window with my elbow, and pulled her out just as the fire began to engulf the room. She clung to me, terrified and coughing, but alive. I carefully descended the ladder, holding her close as the firefighters arrived. The girl's eyes were wide with gratitude, and for a brief moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. But as the crowd swarmed around us, I knew I couldn't stay. I slipped away, unnoticed, back into the shadows where I belonged. 9 years passed in a blur of darkness and despair. I was 23, homeless, and utterly lost. Life had become a cruel joke, and I was the punchline. Every day was a battle to survive, and every night, I wondered if I'd make it to the next morning. My body had grown weaker, my spirit even more so. I often thought about the girl I had saved from the fire. Her terrified face haunted my dreams, but her gratitude, her smile, kept me going. It was the only thing that reminded me that I had done something good in this world, even if no one else knew about it. One winter night, as I lay on a park bench, freezing and on the brink of giving up, I felt a strange sense of peace. I closed my eyes, ready to let go, when suddenly, I woke up in a hospital bed. A doctor stood over me, grumbling about how some woman had panicked and called an ambulance. They saved me, but I couldn't understand why. The world wouldn't miss one less homeless person. But then I remembered her smile, the girl I had saved. It gave me the strength to try again. I attempted to find work, but without documents, I was nobody. My past was a void, and my future seemed just as bleak. I stayed on the streets, blending into the background, until one day, everything changed. I was sitting in my usual spot, watching the world pass me by, when I noticed a girl staring at me. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, and there was something familiar about her. She didn't just glance and move on like the others, she looked at me with intent, as if she knew me. My heart raced as she approached. "Please tell me," she said softly, "did you save a girl from a burning house 9 years ago?" I froze. It couldn't be. But as I looked into her eyes, I knew it was her, the girl I had saved. She had found me. I tried to deny it, to tell her she had the wrong person, but she wouldn't let it go. "Your voice," she said, "it's the same. And your eyes. I'll never forget those eyes." She reached for my hands, and I instinctively pulled back, but she was persistent. She turned them over, revealing the scars from that night, the night I had shattered the window to save her. Her eyes filled with tears. "It's you," she whispered. "I've been searching for you all these years." I didn't know what to say. How could I explain the life I had lived since then? The hopelessness, the shame. But she didn't care. She took my hand and told me she wasn't leaving without me. Her name was Susie, and she insisted on taking me to her apartment. I resisted at first, but eventually, I gave in. What did I have to lose? She talked about how she had never forgotten me, how she had scoured the internet, watched countless news reports, trying to find any trace of the man who saved her life. Her father was a police officer, she said, and he could help me get back on my feet. I doubted it, but the sincerity in her eyes made me want to believe. When we arrived at her apartment, I was overwhelmed by how warm and inviting it was. It was a far cry from the cold, empty spaces I had called home for the past 9 years. She gave me clean clothes, a hot meal, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt human again. Her father was stern but kind. He helped me recover my documents and scolded me for not coming forward sooner. He even found me a job as a security guard, something that didn't require much physical strength but still made me feel useful. Susie visited me often, checking in on me, making sure I didn't slip back into the darkness. She gave me a phone and insisted on calling me every day. Slowly, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could have a life again. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Susie became more than just the girl I had saved. She became a friend, a confidant, and eventually, something more. One day, I mustered up the courage to ask her to a concert. She smiled, that same smile that had saved me so many years ago, and said yes. It was the beginning of something new, something I never thought I could have. But as I looked into Susie's eyes that night, I realized that maybe, just maybe, fate had given me a second chance. As our relationship blossomed, life began to feel normal again, at least, as normal as it could for someone who had spent nearly a decade in the shadows. But just when I started to believe that the worst was behind me, a ghost from my past reappeared. It started with a letter, an unmarked envelope left on my doorstep. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message written in neat, precise handwriting: "You can't escape what you left behind, Victor." My heart pounded as I stared at the words, the paper trembling in my hands. It had been years since anyone had called me by that name. I had become someone else, reborn from the ashes of a life I tried to forget. But someone knew. Someone remembered. I didn't tell Susie about the letter. I couldn't bring myself to burden her with the weight of my past. But the fear gnawed at me, day and night, until I could no longer ignore it. The second letter arrived a week later. This time, it was more direct: "You stole from me. Now it's time to pay." Stole? The accusation didn't make sense. I had nothing. How could I have stolen from anyone? But the letters kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. Whoever was behind them knew everything about me, where I lived, where I worked, even the nights Susie stayed over. And then one night, after Susie had left for home, I found a final letter on my doorstep. This one was different. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. A time, a place, and a single sentence: "Come alone, or she dies." I didn't know what to expect when I arrived at the abandoned warehouse. It was the kind of place where shadows lived and secrets festered. My hands trembled as I pushed open the rusted door, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure standing in the center of the room was a man I hadn't seen in years, a face from the life I thought I had left behind. He was older, more weathered, but the coldness in his eyes was unmistakable. "Hello, Victor," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Long time, no see." His name was Eric, and we had once been friends, if you could call it that. We had grown up in the same neighborhood, both of us victims of broken homes and broken dreams. But while I had tried to escape the darkness, Eric had embraced it. He had become a criminal, and I had become his scapegoat. It was Eric who had framed me for a crime I didn't commit, forcing me to run. And now, he had found me. "You stole from me," he spat, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You took the life I deserved." "I never took anything from you," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear gripping my heart. "I just wanted to survive." Eric sneered. "Survive? You think you can just walk away from everything you did? You think you can have a happy ending?" I braced myself for what was coming next. But instead of attacking, Eric stepped back and pointed to a figure tied to a chair in the shadows. My heart stopped as I recognized her, Susie. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her face was bruised. She struggled against the ropes that bound her, but they were too tight. "Eric, don't do this," I pleaded, desperation creeping into my voice. "She has nothing to do with this. Let her go." But Eric was beyond reason. "This is your punishment," he said coldly. "You ruined my life, so now I'm going to ruin yours." I had no choice. I lunged at him, using every ounce of strength I had left. The fight was brutal, and in the end, I was the one who stood over him, gasping for breath. But I didn't kill him. I couldn't. I had spent too many years in darkness to let it consume me again. The police arrived soon after, summoned by a call I had made before walking into the warehouse. Eric was arrested, and Susie was safe. But the scars of that night would never fully heal. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. Eric was behind bars, and Susie and I were finally free from the shadows of the past. We moved into a new apartment, far away from the memories that haunted us. And for the first time in a long time, I began to feel at peace. Susie and I grew closer with each passing day, and soon, we were inseparable. The horrors of the past had brought us together, and we knew that nothing could tear us apart. On a warm summer day, surrounded by friends and family, I asked Susie to marry me. She said yes, her smile brighter than the sun. And in that moment, I knew that I had finally found the happiness I had been searching for all my life. As we stood together, hand in hand, I realized that no matter how dark the past had been, the future was filled with light. And this time, I wasn't going to let it slip away. If you liked this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.